All right. Hello, and welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Oh, microphone is not, there we go. Yeah, welcome to History Chats. We have an interesting program here. Let me just go to the double cameras. There we go. Hey, so we're joined by Erick Konop, who is going to be sharing some of the experiences he'd been working on researching and writing an online exhibit that we are pretty much ready to let the world know that it exists, which is exciting. I'm just going to make sure that everything is still functioning. Looks like it is. Great. We thought we'd maybe start with a little bit of just discussion about where the exhibit came from. I don't know, Erick, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this exhibit, Crossing the Old Wisconse, is on the history of, I think we ended up with 15 historic bridges. But that's not initially what we set out to do. If I can get to the next page here. So this kind of unintentionally grew out of a project that is still ongoing with the Great Pinery Heritage Waterway Trail, which is a kayak trail, kayak and canoe trail on the Wisconsin River and some of its tributaries. MCHS has been collaborating with their crew to develop interpretive signs for some landings along the riverway that would point out historic sites along the riverways. And the plan was that there would be an additional online component that would link back to our website, and that was always kind of a nebulous thing. We weren't sure exactly what that was going to be. Initially, it was going to be historic buildings, entertainment venues, dams, and 2 historic bridges.
But I think there's also sort of like, we knew where well, actually here, let me switch to my microphone. Yeah. A little bit clear here. So can give a little explanation here. So we did end up putting together a story. It was interesting, and actually I should note that this waterway, if you're looking to do some kayaking or canoeing on the Wisconsin River, it is there's a whole website, Great Pinery. It has all the information that you'll need to explore it. And actually, I believe the grand opening is coming up later this month on August 26th. So if you're interested in checking that out, you should. Great place to go here. And putting that together, it was, sometimes when you do historic sort of sites things, we're able to say like, oh, this is a good place for a sign. In this case, it was kind of dictated in a lot of areas by like, well, this is a great place for a landing. And so then we had to figure out, okay, what's around here? And sometimes we had like, this is a great bridge that we could talk about that's right here, or, here's where this company was, or a story that attached here. And sometimes we had to go a little bit further out. But in the process, we spent about a year doing the research and writing and kind of breaking those stories and figuring out what fit. And as Erick said, that like, we only had 2 bridges that made the cut. Specifically stories about the bridges. I think they appear in other, capacities. But Erick had already, done a lot of research into some of these other things. And originally we thought, well, maybe we could also do some other, like some dams and some other things. But it just kind of worked out that the story worked well enough to stand on its own.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that likes obscure topics and especially like industrial things, stuff like that. And you know, I was the one that got assigned the bridges, and I kind of ran with it. My main job here, as you may or may not know, is overseeing the Yawkey House and running tours, and that's pretty busy right around this time of the year. But you know, once school starts, people stop traveling for the winter. It's not a terribly busy job, but I do like to keep.
Unless it is.
Unless it is. Yeah, unless something breaks on the house, or you know, we get a bus tour or something that comes through. But there's more downtime, and I just kind of went into this and made it my pet project. And then you and our former coworker Martina were a little bit more busy because archives is more of a year-round constant thing, and yeah, it just kind of ended up being a bridge project after a while, and you know, happy accident.
Yeah. So you're going to tell us about some of the bridges.
Yeah.
Some stories here.
So if I can get this to change here, there we go. So yeah, this was the result, crossing the Old Wisconse and other rivers in Marathon County. And it was, I believe, 15 bridges that we ended up with. The thing about these bridges is, other than really grand scale ones like, you know, the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, they're kind of a mundane thing. Like, you don't think about the bridges that you drive across in your morning commute. They're just kind of there. They do their thing. But bridges can really be a bellwether for larger trends, developments in communities. There's a reason that we're building them, and there's a reason that we're building them where they are. You know, things like expansion of cities, and you see that on Bull Falls, not far from where we are right now. Bridges go up there because we're expanding west as a community. Bridge Street is another good example. New industries coming in. Bridge Street Bridge was the Lee Beebe Bridge for a long time because there was a mill on the west side, and rather than go all the way around and go through downtown Wausau to get to the mill, they put a bridge there. You also see new forms of transportation coming in, the railroads arriving in the 1870s, and now there's railroad bridges, or the automobile coming in, and we have to look at these horse and buggy bridges, and we realize that, you know, they're not going to work for what we're doing. So you see the change of these communities through the bridges themselves. I'm just going to pull up a quick map here, and this is basically a screen grab from the landing page of the site. I did try to grab a wide variety of bridges to represent as much of the county as I could, and I think I did a fairly good job of that, considering that I'm stuck with the waterways for the most part. I'm not going to be able to find a bridge where there's not a bridge, or you know, we did a waterway. Yeah, I did try to stay tied to that because it's kind of where this whole thing came from. So Ben, did you have a link that you wanted to share for this?
Yeah, so there will be a link in the description. I'm going to hold off publishing it right now so
Sure.
that you listen to Erick's story. You know, but afterwards, if you want to go and explore, we'll give you a link to that. Yeah. Do you want to just
Jump in?
Yeah, these are some of the stories that maybe didn't
make it. Yeah, not every bridge that I researched made it in. You know, there were some that there just wasn't a story for. There were others that maybe there was a story, but there were better examples, and there are some where we didn't really have any images of them, and those are all things that can make it hard to tell that story of that bridge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad bridge or a bad story, and these are just 3 of the bridges that didn't quite make the cut, or they kind of fell short. So the first one, this is a personal favorite, and I really wanted this one to make it into the exhibit. The Single Avenue Corkscrew Bridge. Single Avenue is just a couple of miles, probably less than 2 miles south of where we are off of Grand Avenue. Well, I thought this was a great bridge and it had a great story. It was pretty clear right away that it wasn't going to make the cut for reasons that we'll talk about here. So this is where the bridge is roughly, or where it would have been. Like I said, right off of Grand Avenue. And if in 1908 you were heading south down Grand Avenue in the vicinity of Thomas Street, off to your left side you would have seen a tall arch bridge going over the what would have been the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad cut there. And as you got closer to it, you would notice that it wasn't connected to the road. Despite appearing to be completely finished, it was just kind of sitting there in midair about 10 feet above anything else. Naturally, you would probably wonder why someone would build a bridge like that. Some people suggested that it was built tall to be more visible from Grand Avenue. This is a developing community. We're trying to be as prestigious as possible, and maybe we want to heighten the beauty of Grand Avenue so that it lives up to its name. But the pilot, the Wausau pilot here, says that that's ridiculous, and that this is, quote, nothing more than a stupid piece of work by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company. So as it turns out, what happened is the Chicago and Northwestern had demolished a previous bridge there so they could do some work on their railroad cut, and then they never replaced it, claiming that it was the city's job to deal with it. Eventually, the city goes to the State Railroad Commission and says, you guys need to do something about this. This is a private company running amok. And the Railroad Commission draws up an article of agreement between the two, saying that the bridge needs to be replaced. But they don't specify how. They don't specify how high it should be, figuring that anyone in their right mind will come to the conclusion that it should be reachable and that it should connect to the road. The city looks at this, they agree, they contract with the railroad. They also fail to mention how high the bridge should be, assuming that it's going to line up, it's going to be identical to the old one. The railroad company, perhaps feeling a little bit vindictive, being forced to pay for a replacement, builds the bridge 10 feet up in the air with no approaches. Now, that's interesting enough, but it doesn't explain why it's called a corkscrew bridge. Well, because it's 10 feet in the air and it's right up against the roadways, something needs to be done so it can be used. And eventually what happens is the Wausau Iron Works comes in and they rebuild the approaches, and the result is something very similar to this. Now, this is a replica of another corkscrew bridge at the Little Log House Pioneer Village in Hastings, Minnesota. Basically, the approaches of the bridge spiral underneath themselves, and somebody thought that looked kind of like a corkscrew, and we get the name Corkscrew Bridge. Even with this new improvement, it was apparently still too steep for horse teams or any sort of heavy traffic to handle, and presumably it was replaced shortly after these approaches were installed because it just wasn't practical. So this is the location of the bridge today. There is no bridge at Single Avenue anymore. It dead ends at the tracks, at the railroad cut on both sides. There's no further mention of this corkscrew bridge. We don't know what happened to it when it was replaced. Probably didn't take too long after that article for it to get replaced. But as it sits now, there's no sign of what was probably the most unique bridge in Wausau. So it's a great story, but why didn't it make it? Well, first of all, it doesn't cross a waterway. That was the big thing. We are trying to tie this back to the Waterways project, so without that, we're kind of dead in the water to begin with. It's also only mentioned in a single article, November 25th, 1913, by the Wausau pilot. So it's not very well documented. A single article is not enough to confirm all aspects of the story. The pilot's reliable, but it is a little bit more of the liberal-leaning paper of the day for what that's worth at the time. Another paper like the Daily Herald may have had a totally different view on this city versus company sort of scuffle, and we don't get that aspect of the story. It's just an editorial from one person from one newspaper. we also don't know what it looked like. The article itself describes an arch bridge that could be a lot of things. It could have been wooden, stone, steel. We don't know. There's also a bunch of different kinds of arch bridge. And we certainly don't have any pictures of it to confirm or deny any aspects of its construction. And then there's no longer a bridge at this location, and there hasn't been from some time, for what I can tell. The current bridge crosses at Prospect Avenue. Single avenue, as I said, just kind of dead ends. So that's the first bridge that didn't make the cut. And that's an example of one where we don't have any images of it. We got a good story, but there's nothing to show for it, and that makes for kind of a boring exhibit. The other bridge is the Brooklyn Bridge, not that one, this one. So the Brooklyn Bridge is kind of the opposite side of the spectrum. Thanks to the famous, or locally famous, photographer James Colby, we do have some very good photos of the Brooklyn Bridge, but the history isn't there, or at least not that I've been able to find. So this was located in Edgar, as we can see, labeled by Mr. Colby there, and what was probably going to be a postcard, or it is a postcard, right?
Hard to know.
Hard to know. Okay. Yeah.
But this is, I think, a glass plate negative.
This particular one is a negative.
Which is why we have the degrading on the sides there.
So the area south of Scotch Creek in Edgar, that neighborhood was apparently known as Brooklyn, and that would place this bridge on South 3rd Avenue over Scotch Creek in this area, and there actually is still a bridge there. I haven't been able to find why this was named Brooklyn. I've looked through town memory books and articles, and they mention the Brooklyn Bridge, and they mention the neighborhood of Brooklyn. Even the newspapers going into the 1990s, there's advertisements for homes and businesses for sale in the Brooklyn neighborhood, so everybody seems to know that that's Brooklyn, but I can't seem to find a reason that it would be called that. Maybe one of our viewers knows.
Yeah,
who knows?
let us know.
So as I mentioned, there is still a bridge here today, and it looks actually like at least one of the buildings from the Colby photo is standing. It's kind of obscured by trees here, but back there you can see in this other great Colby image of the Brooklyn Bridge right there. And then you come around and the house is still there. So we've got some great photos of the bridge and its successors. But again, this one didn't make it. And mostly that comes down to very little documentation. There's no mention of it in the newspapers or really in town histories, other than, hey, here's a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's the Colby pictures, almost inevitably. And that seems to be pretty common with these little rural crossings. They don't attract a lot of attention unless something happens. If the town steamroller goes over it and it falls through into the creek, then it gets mentioned. There actually is a bridge in the exhibit where exactly that happened. But the Brooklyn Bridge probably just did its thing until it wore out, and then they replaced it. There's nothing about it that seemed remarkable at the time, so nobody wrote down the story. What history we do have is really muddy. There's 3 separate Brooklyn bridges that show up in our archival collection. There's a wooden bridge, the Colby Truss, and those are both labeled on the negatives themselves as being the Brooklyn Bridge. And then there's also a smaller truss bridge, a pony truss, just a little guy that's labeled as the Brooklyn Bridge in our files, but not on the negative itself. So that might have been one. It may not have been. The background looks a little bit different on it. So either the road was realigned at one point, or it might just be mislabeled. We don't know when any of these were built. Or when they were demolished, and it makes it hard to really tell a cohesive story. So, in the end, this one didn't make it.
Well, also point out, just point out also that we don't necessarily have as complete of a newspaper record of some of the county newspapers. Presumably, the folks in Edgar would have newspaper coverage that would have given more context, but because we're largely dealing with the Wausau Daily Herald and the Pilot, which is the main sources that we've accumulated and are available, it's just one of those things that it's not like we didn't even the folks in Edgar didn't talk about it. It's just we don't necessarily have access, which is another reason why a lot of these bridges. It's not to say that they weren't important. It's just to say that based off of what we have, we can only say so much.
Well, yeah, no, by no means am I saying that this wasn't an important bridge. That's basically the only way to get to the Brooklyn neighborhood. But it was probably one of those bridges that it was just a good bridge, and it did what it was expected to do, and it didn't cause any trouble, so nobody took note of it because it was just always there.
So just like a lot of the bridges, they just kind of disappeared in the background.
They just kind of do their thing. The final one, yep. And this is one where actually I had a good image and a decent story. And this is the Isle of Ferns pedestrian footbridge, which we're, if you're local here at least, probably familiar. It's an old railroad bridge that goes out to Isle of Ferns from Oak Island Park. You can see it right there. This bridge is an interesting enough bridge. There's been a bridge in this location since probably 1928. The island that becomes Fern Island Park was donated by the Wisconsin Valley Electric Company to become a park, and pretty shortly after that, a bridge goes up. Originally, it was on the north side, actually. So if I go back here, it's as you can see, it's coming from the east side of the island. Originally, they describe it as being towards the north side by the vocational school. But as with a lot of these small bridges on the Wisconsin River, almost every year when ice goes out, bridges go with it. And this one, more often than not, seems to have been one of those bridges that went away with the spring ice out. And over the years, we would get a slew of different bridges, including this one from the 50s, which is actually just a bunch of surplus telephone poles roped together. Just something to get people out there quick. Now, the one that we're familiar with is actually a salvaged railroad bridge. There wasn't a bridge or a railroad line out to Fern Island. The railroad bridge that we know is actually from Tomahawk. And was moved, I believe, in 1964, if I'm remembering correctly. And the main beams or the sides of the bridge were salvaged. The rest of it was scrapped. And then a new roadway was constructed, and the current bridge was put up. So we do have some good documentation for this bridge. And, it would seem like one that we would want to include. The reasons I didn't include it, first of all, it's built from salvaged parts. It's kind of a Franken bridge, if you will. It's got a modern deck, modern supports, and then just a couple of the beams actually come from a railroad bridge from Tomahawk. So it's kind of a historic bridge. It's kind of a modern bridge. It's not a bad bridge. The story's cool. They moved an entire bridge to reuse this thing. But there are other relocated bridges in Wisconsin. Most of the railroad bridges downtown are relocated, and they have a longer and more compelling history and a little bit better documentation. They're also better preserved. A couple of them, it was the entire bridge that was moved and not just a piece. This was a footbridge. It's purely for recreational use. It's just been used for strollers and hikers to get out to the bridge. It doesn't have any more in-depth history than that. And there really wasn't a bridge here for most of the history of the Fern Island bridges. It's been to the north, and those aren't as well documented as this one, so I can't really give you a background on them. So for what it's worth, that's why we didn't end up going with this one. Yeah, so those are my cutting room floor. Pass it back to you.
Yeah. So that would we just end a little bit here. Oop, that's the wrong one. So this is the exhibit itself. So we have, Eric showed this map here. It's a little bit more interactable. And then we have all of the bridges. And you can click any of these and it'll take you to hopefully, there you go, the story about that particular bridge. But I think we wanted to maybe just end with a little bit of discussion about the title itself. And I'm just realizing, I need to change this image because we used the typo with there's 3 S's. Oh, well, we'll fix that. We'll fix that. Ignore that. But the old Wisconse is interesting. We originally, titles are hard for exhibits at the best of times. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what's a good exhibit title? The bridges of Marathon County isn't the most evocative of the stories we're trying to tell. So we're thinking like crossing the Wisconsin or something like that, and we hit upon the Old Wisconse, which is a phrase that gets used occasionally to reference the Wisconsin River, and so that seems a little bit more appropriate. To note, if you actually look at some of the that's sort of the overarching title, but for example, let's see here, the bridges of the Old Eau Claire, or the Dells. We did adapt it, so it is also crossing the Eau Claire and the Rib River as well. But anyway, the Old Wisconse is actually interesting because if you dig into it, it's a title that is used, mostly attributed to the lumbermen, the people who worked on the river and lived on the river and traveled by the river. And before the railroads, before the highways and airports, and the way that you got around was on the river. That was kind of the familiar term that they would use. Like they knew it was called the Wisconsin. No, they weren't under the assumption that it was called the Wisconse, but it was sort of like that familiar, like, we know it, we live here, we work on it. And it particularly takes on, with the time that the turn of the century, it takes on a new connotation of the Old Wisconse. Old gets used because the river was really changing. And particularly for these people who, again, had lived and worked and traveled on the river, it didn't seem the same. We weren't using it to raft logs down like we used to the sawmills. The sawmills themselves were increasingly being powered by steam engines and other sort of means of power. We weren't using literally the water falling from one point to another to power a wheel in the same way into the 20th century. And people weren't traveling by it. And there's this poem that we quote here that William Ellis wrote, a long poem called The Old Wisconse, which seems to kind of popularized, at least in some ways, the phrase into the 20th century. But it is really a sort of like, hey, the Wisconsin as we knew it is not really a thing anymore. It's, people don't appreciate the beauty because they're getting in a train car and they're just kind of, all of a sudden, after a few hours, you can go from one side of the state to the other, and you don't really get a sense of the beauty of the river, the natural splendor that it has, which it still does. It's just we don't get to appreciate it as much. And also, even the dangerous, even the formative parts of it, the flooding and the all of the stuff that can happen. People don't, if you don't respect the river in the same way, if you don't have to ride some logs and raft down it, you don't have to interact with it. And even the flooding was, now we're starting to create reservoirs and dams to manage the river in a way that is going to make it so it's not as destructive. And so there's this sort of idea of the Old Wisconsin as being this old-fashioned, or the former, the river as it should be, or maybe not should be. I don't think it's necessarily saying people are wrong for thinking of the river differently. It's not a judgmental thing, but it's more of a conceptual thing. It's like a nostalgia in a sense. And I thought that was, it actually takes on an interesting characteristic because we're doing an exhibit about the bridges, right? And the bridges, they're not necessarily responsible for the change, but, with the trains going through, well, the train's got to cross the river at some point and you're going to do it on a bridge. When automobiles show up and we need to suddenly connect parts of the county that didn't exist before or, weren't as connected. Well, we need more bridges, and those bridges aren't going to work the same way for the wagons that we've been using before. So let's replace them. And as things move forward, it's not just crossing from one side of a river to the other. It's also sort of a metaphoric crossing from the Old Wisconse into the future. And the bridges are really a facilitator of that. And so even though it was completely by happenstance, we didn't necessarily start when we were starting the idea of doing a bridge exhibit. We didn't necessarily have that intention there. But I think it is a really good opportunity to, again, like Eric said at the beginning, you don't necessarily think about the bridges as you cross over them. They're not designed to be. If they're doing what they're supposed to do, you shouldn't worry about whether you're the river there or whatever. But hey, this is an opportunity to become more familiar with some of these bridges that you might use and the challenges that came, sometimes considerable challenges in the decision to where they are and why they still exist. And again, linking back to the Pinery, the Great Pinery Heritage Waterway, which is the genesis of this and is still a great opportunity. We might not get a chance to appreciate the river as they did in the past, but and we can't go back to that. We're not going to expect local companies to start powering their equipment with water wheels anymore. But you can still get out and if you're interested in experiencing the waterways of the county, this is a great resource to do it with. So there, I think I've hit the quota for pitching the collaboration there. Yeah, there you go. That's the story. I think that kind of covers what we were looking at covering.
Yeah.
Was there anything you want to add?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well.
I'm just going to check to see if there are any questions. I don't expect that there will be, but certainly if anybody gets under the wire and we go, stop and you just hit send, we'll stick around and try to answer those if you have any. Otherwise, we'll post the link and you can go explore the river crossing the Old Wisconse on your own. We hope you do. I know Eric put about a year and a half of his life into researching and writing this, so it'd be great.
Excited to see it out.
Yeah. So with that, if you're still watching, let me just let you know what's coming up next week. We also have interesting thing happening next week. If you're a member of the Historical Society, you might have gotten an invite to an event next week. We, in the state of Wisconsin, one of the highest awards for local history is called the Reuben Goldthwait Award. And we are, fortunate enough to be given that award this year. So for the 2023, it's this award here. This is just a quick Photoshop that I did here, but this is Christian Overland, who's the head of the State Historical Society. And I think this is maybe Ripon is where he's giving it for last year, but this is the trophy. And this is the guy it's named after, the Reuben Goldthwait Award. And so I thought it would be a good, timely opportunity to, since, next Thursday we will be having the ceremony to receive that. And we will officially be the recipient after next week. Hey, where does this come from and why is this interesting? Who is this guy and what did he do? It's a really fascinating story. So yeah, that's what's coming up next week. Hope you join us for that. I guess in the meantime, thank you for watching. And I'll just give it one more look here to see if there's anything that popped in, but all right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you for some more history in the future. Have a rest of your day. Have a wonderful rest of your day.